This is Jeff Spittler, June 4th, 2000, A Tale of Two Kingdoms, Part 27. Okay, well, last week we covered how during the last few years of his life, James and his bishops used the Court of High Commission to further persecute the church. And then we covered James' death briefly and spent a fair amount of time reviewing his life and kind of looking at the lessons that might be learned from the interaction of James and the church during his reign. So today we're going to start by covering his successor, Charles the First. Sort of the first part, I sort of have three parts in parallel, which are roughly Charles and his interaction with the church apart from Charles in Scotland, and a little bit about the church in England and the rise of Arminianism. So we start with Charles. Several thousand years ago, there was a wise but imperfect monarch who died and left the kingdom to his son. And story is told that after he died, so it happened, this is 1 Kings 12:2, when Jeroboam the son of Nebat heard it, he was still in Egypt, for he had fled from the presence of King Solomon and had been dwelling in Egypt, that they sent and called him. Then Jeroboam and the whole assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the burdensome service of your father, and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you. So he said to them, Depart for 3 days, then come back to me. And the people departed. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who stood before his father Solomon while he still lived, and he said, How do you advise me to answer these people? And they spoke to him, saying, If you will be a servant to these people today, and serve them, and answer them, and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. But he rejected the advice which the elders had given him, and consulted the young men who had grown up with him who stood before him. And he said to them, What advice do you give? How should we answer this people who have spoken to me, saying, Lighten the yoke which your father put on us? Then the young men who had grown up with him spoke to him, saying, Thus you should speak to this people who have spoken to you, saying, Your father made our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter on us. Thus you shall say to them, My little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist. And now, whereas my father put a heavy yoke on you, I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges. So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the 3rd day, as the king had directed, saying, Come back to me the 3rd day. Then the king answered the people roughly, and rejected the advice which the elders had given him. And he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges. So the king did not listen to the people, for the turn of events was from the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord had spoken by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Now when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, saying, What share have we in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to your own house, O David. Well, many years later, a very smart but much more foolish king died and left the kingdom to his son. And not to make too much of the analogy, but in many respects, Charles' reign reminds me of Rehoboam's. Certainly Charles could have pursued a course of moderation. James, for all his foolishness, at least knew that sometimes he needed to back off. And so, in fact, I think as we saw last time, the Articles of Perth, although they were enforced some places rigorously, other places they weren't enforced. Charles really didn't know when to back off. He took a lot of foolish counsel, the sort of counsel that Rehoboam took. Rehoboam lost most of his kingdom. Charles lost all of his kingdom, lost his head. So as I was reflecting on, thinking about Charles, I couldn't help but think about Rehoboam and the sort of course that he took. Immediately after James died, there was a brief respite in the persecution of the church. For one thing, the Court of High Commission only existed by fiat of James. And so when he died, it ceased to exist, and its commission expired, as it were. That allowed some of the ministers who had been exiled to return. Robert Bruce returned from Inverness to Edinburgh. But this respite didn't last long. Shortly after he acceded to the throne, Charles wrote the Archbishop of St. Andrews, Spotswood, that he was to continue on the same course and that he was to enforce the ecclesiastical changes made under James. And let's see. James had died in March of 1625. In August of 1625, Charles issued a royal proclamation which commanded obedience to the 5 Articles of Perth, right, which included taking communion in a kneeling position, private baptism and communion, and several other things. In September, he commanded the Town Council of Edinburgh to choose magistrates who conformed to the 5 Articles of Perth. And he put some more teeth in that a little bit later. But anyways, he in 1626, he began a course of what was known as revocation. Right, all the kings of Scotland, at least, when they had been ruled under by the minority, there was a standing policy that when they turned 25, they could revoke the gifts that had been made in their minority in the lands that had been given out. And Charles started to make some noise that he was going to revoke gifts of property made by his father, which wouldn't be quite the same thing, but I guess he could argue that it was analogous to it. You might recall James was very free with gifts, and we have the famous story where one of his counselors piled up all the gold that represented one of the gifts and put it in a room and had James come see it, and then he changed his mind about the gift, but made all these gifts to his favorites and also others who he was trying to sway or impress. So Charles started to make some noise about that, and there was a lot of political fallout from that, and I don't intend to go over it, but the other thing that he did was he attempted to sort of recover the tithes. You remember Scotland had this very complex system of tithing that included things like, say, property had a certain rent on it that was given in real goods. So if it was farmland, a certain amount of the barley or wheat might be turned in as a tithe. And with the church feuing or sort of selling off the rights to this, some of these tithes then were actually going to private landowners who had, say, bought it from the church, so to speak. So it's a very long and sort of complex story, all the sort of machinations. Charles tried to get a Scottish Parliament to take some action on it. They finally just decided to appoint a commission to study the issue, as legislative bodies will tend to do when they can't reach consensus. About the same time, this is a quote from Hetherington, Charles did one of the few even seemingly prudent acts of his strangely imprudent life. He came up with a plan, or we think Spotswood came up with a plan, to grandfather in ministers if they'd come into the church before the introduction of the 5 Articles of Perth, then they wouldn't have to conform. But this could have been somewhat in an insidious way successful, right, if he'd carried through with this. But the king reversed himself. It's thought that this was Spotswood's idea, the Archbishop of St. Andrews. But at about the same time, there were some younger and more aggressive prelates, bishops, coming up who couldn't stand the idea of giving in at all. Well, we'll get to this a little bit later, but there was if you will, a younger and more aggressive party, also an Arminian party in the church, who basically was on the rise at this time. Okay, well, in 1629, Charles put some teeth in his order to the magistrates of Edinburgh. He ordered them to keep a list of, he had basically ordered a quarterly communion be held at Holyrood House, and they had to attend at least once a year to keep their jobs. And elsewhere, ministers were to keep a list of non-communicants, and if you were a non-communicant, you couldn't keep a sort of publicly held job, in the government. Okay, so about the same time, so this sort of covers roughly the first 5 years of Charles's reign. About the same time, there were a series of revivals, primarily in southwest Scotland. Okay, not to be confused with modern man-made revivals, especially not to be confused with revivals that we hear about in Oklahoma, where they put up you'll see an ad in the Stillwater News Press occasionally that such and such church is holding a revival. And usually that means that they've got a tent with wood shavings and so on, and they put it up somewhere, and you're supposed to come and hear some guest preacher speak. Something like that, right, Mike? You're sort of an expert on Oklahoma.
Yeah, I really like when they do the primitive deal where they try to, play with snakes too.
The play with the snake handling business, yeah. I've not been to any of those kind of revivals. So, okay, these, of course, I wasn't there, but from the accounts, these were apparently real God-made revivals where people fell under intense conviction of sin. Large numbers of people were converted, and the effects were long-lasting. So that, in fact, I was reading this direct dictionary of Scottish church history and theology, and somehow I came across Billy Graham, a listing there, and he mentioned that in one of his, he didn't call it a revival, but one of his crusades, there were a large number of responses, but then afterwards there was very little increase in church attendance, and then the second crusade that happened in Scotland had very little impact at all. So unlike some of those sorts of revivals, the effect of the revival lasted a lot longer. So there was, in fact, one in Stewarton, which is in Ayrshire in southwest Scotland, and the revival itself lasted a period of about 5 years, from 1625 to 1630. And during that time, people were converted on a regular basis, and the effects of the revival lasted a lot longer. This was by the mockers of the time called the Stewarton sickness. Okay, but at the Kirk of Shotts, Shotts is in Lanarkshire, which is also in the southwest part of Glasgow. In 1630, a visiting preacher, visiting because there was a communion, a season, if you will, where a number of people from surrounding area attended, and this John Livingston preached at the service, and I guess, as it turned out, there was, the day after, a lot of people stayed, and there was a desire for him to preach, which he tried to avoid, but he finally agreed to preach. And according to, nearly contemporary accounts, this is an account of Robert Fleming, who was born in 1630, so he would have been too young to be an eyewitness, but he would have been old enough to have known many eyewitnesses, said that it was known, as I can speak on sure ground, that nearly 500 had at that time a discernible change wrought on them, of whom most proved lively Christians afterward. It was the sowing of the seed through Clydesdale, so that many of the most eminent Christians of that country could date either their conversion or some remarkable confirmation of their case from that day. The minister, John Livingston, had one time been the minister of Anwoth, which is the parish where Samuel Rutherford was pastor, and that Samuel Rutherford succeeded John Livingston. Livingston said in his diaries that the parish had gotten far better because afterwards they'd gotten Mr. Samuel Rutherford. Okay, Livingston had later been called to Torpichin, not really sure, but he wouldn't take an oath that he would conform to the 5 Articles of Perth, so the Archbishop wouldn't confirm him as minister, wouldn't let him serve. And Hetherington makes this note, when such men as Livingston were excluded from a parish by the prelates, they were actually compelled to extend their influence over a wider sphere than otherwise would have been possible or right. And it wasn't just Livingston, but other men who had to sort of have an informal ministry because they'd been turned out of a formal ministry had a much wider sphere of influence than otherwise they might have had. I couldn't help but being reminded of, in our own day, of Greg Bonson, who for various reasons, ended up, in effect, being thrown out of his pastorate at the church in Southern California. Let's see, Dan and I visited there right after that had happened. And I think because of that, because of a series of events, he'd actually been let go from his job as a professor of theology, a professor at Reformed Theological Seminary, and then as a minister, basically lost his job. I think because of that, he had actually found a much wider audience than he ever would have found having just been a professor of theology or a minister at this church. Okay, well, just to give you a sort of a picture here, I also mentioned that Samuel Rutherford became minister in Anwoth. This was in 1627. So did he have to take this oath of conformity to the Articles of Perth? And according to his earliest biographer, McWard, the answer was no. And a very recent biographer, John Coffey, says that though this was unusual, a number of militant young ministers were ordained in the Presbyterian fashion. And he says, in this case, perhaps with the bishop taking his place among the other presbyters. The local bishop, his name was Lamb, was reputedly a moderate Episcopalian. And so, perhaps there were some places where there was some compromise and the business of the church went on. Anyways, that's apparently what happened. Okay, well, in England, and to a lesser extent in Scotland, although it did follow, another trend that was occurring, again, roughly at the same time, was the rise of Arminianism. Okay, and this dates in England roughly from the early 1620s, and so in fact the bishops that were influential with James at the end of his life were Arminians, and certainly the ones that were influential with Charles early on were very Arminian. Let's see, Arminius himself lived from 1560 to 1609. He was a Dutch theologian. But the Arminian, I'll say heresy, it was a lot older than that, right? It's the same as semi-Pelagianism, right? The idea that, it's sort of a compromise between the complete free will position and the God's sovereignty, so that the idea that the human heart not being totally depraved or totally fallen somehow contributes to salvation. The idea that it cooperates with God. Speaking of Billy Graham, the being put very loosely, God has one vote and Satan has one vote, and you have the deciding vote. I think you all probably know what I'm talking about. But okay, but we're pretty much familiar with the sort of evangelical form here. Mike, you're going to make a very important comment, I can tell.
What are you talking about?
What am I talking about? Arminianism.
Oh, this
Oh, that was supposedly a quote by some of these famous sort of revival preachers.
Did that not make man really sovereign?
Well, you could say that, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a sort of, I've heard this, quoted recently, or since I've been moved to Oklahoma. So this idea, I think the other way it's been put is that basically there's no use praying for these people that have come forward because they have to make the decision. God won't do anything, that.
And this is a heresy that you say?
Yeah, I said that. Exactly. In case I didn't want my view of it to sort of remain vague. Yeah. Okay. It's on tape, on the internet, on the world. Arminianism. Probably, though, how many people are going to get through all the way through to the middle of Lecture 27 to hear it? So.
I think we're going to have to
Well.
highlight that on the website.
Oh, just put it in print there, yeah. Okay. Okay. In an article in this Dictionary of Scottish Church History and Theology, N.R. Needham points out that Arminianism has taken 3 different forms. I hadn't really given it too much thought before that, because we mostly think, around here in terms of the sort of evangelical form. But he points out there's 3 different forms: the sacerdotal, rationalistic, and evangelical. And in the sacerdotal form, grace was conceived as flowing through the sacraments and the Episcopal Church order. So, and part of this Episcopal Church order, of course, is this idea of this continuity of ordination, that Peter ordained bishops and they ordained bishops and so on, this succession, if you will. And I don't know, this is partly the Catholic view today, right, that the Church imparts almost a physical substance of grace. Well, okay, so in England it was more of the sacerdotal form rather than the evangelical form. The Arminian party became prominent in the early 1620s. As I've already mentioned, they were very influential with James. It culminated, in a sense, with William Laud who was one of Charles' advisors, becoming the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633. It only culminated then because the previous archbishop died. In fact, Laud was sort of Charles' number one religious advisor earlier than that. Certainly, in 1628, Laud was the Bishop of London, and he advised Charles closely on Scottish affairs. Of course, this was one of Charles' many mistakes with advisors. I think one of the reasons why James had been, sort of reasonably successful in some respects was that he'd come from Scotland. He knew the people, he had a feeling for what their constitution was and what they could stomach. And Charles had been born in Scotland, but had moved within a year or something to England. So he never lived there. In fact, he'd never even been to Scotland. He does visit Scotland in 1633, but until now he's never even been there. Let's see, Laud was characterized here by Hetherington as, in short, cunning, narrow-minded, bigoted, and malevolent. Okay. Now, we're going to skip over his persecution of the church in England, although that's pretty well known. But it included things like having people's ears chopped off and tongues cut out and those sorts of things. It was this. It's hard for us to imagine today, but it was this view that if anyone's, sort of stood in your way of his view that they were somehow, basically a heretic, and you could do whatever you wanted to them. Okay, in Scotland, then, some of the younger, more aggressive prelates, such as John Maxwell, were followers of Laud. Now, whether they were followers because they saw this was the path to power and riches, or because they thought this was the way that the church should go, or whatever, don't really know. But a particular example is John Maxwell. He was minister of Edinburgh in 1629, one of these ministers who'd been brought in to sort of put the thumb down on the Edinburgh congregations. By 1633, he'd become Bishop of Ross and eventually became the Lord of Exchequer and a member of the Privy Council. Well, he actively tried to impose the Church of England liturgy on the Church of Scotland. In 1630, he was down in London, conferring presumably with Laud and with Charles. He returned with a letter to Spotswood that it was His Majesty's will that the Church of Scotland should adopt the form of worship of the Church of England completely. Spotswood was ordered to convene the bishops. When they met, though, they decided the measure was too dangerous and they postponed further action on it. It's kind of funny here to think of Spotswood as being conservative. He'd, helped James, really get the church under control. But, of course, even Spotswood had an idea that the sorts of things that Laud were proposing were very dangerous, as they turned out to be in a few years. We'll see. Let's see. So Charles made his first trip to Scotland in 1633. His objectives: be crowned King of Scotland, raise more money, and make further impositions on the Church of Scotland. To help with the first and the last objective, and for all I know, the middle objective, he brought William Laud with him, who was at this point not yet Archbishop of Canterbury. So the previous Archbishop Abbot, who had also apparently been a Calvinist but wasn't very popular with Charles, died in the end of 1633, say October, and this trip was made earlier, in about the middle of 1633, actually in June. So for the coronation, Laud decorated the chapel at Holyrood with an organ, with tapestries, and an altar, which among other things had 2 clasped books and 2 unlit candles. The things that Melville mentioned in his witty poem that got him thrown into the tower and then exiled. It's not recorded whether or not any Scottish ministers privately wrote witty poems. If they did, they didn't allow them to be found. Okay, so there's, they have this big coronation service and various things that happened. I think Maxwell, at this worship service before that, I think it was William Henderson, old Scots reader, came in, and he was to read scripture, and Maxwell went down and threw him out of the pulpit while the king was there. So, anyways, and there were a lot of things that went on with the coronation, but we'll skip over those. In order to raise money, it was necessary for Charles to do what? To hold a parliament. It met on June 25th, 1633, and Charles had learned more than a few lessons from his father. He put 10 Englishmen on the Scottish Privy Council, including Laud. The Lords of the Articles, which was the committee of Parliament which drafted all the legislation. So in Parliament there was not necessarily very much debate. Most of the legislation was put together and they were sort of had to accept it, yes or no. That was controlled by men who were the king's men. And after raising taxes, they went on to consider an act called anent His Majesty's royal prerogative and apparel of kirkmen. So anent roughly means concerning His Majesty's royal prerogative and what the ministers and bishops should wear, the apparel of kirkmen. And this act actually really confirms two previous acts. One about the king's royal prerogative and the other about the king's his right to appoint what the churchmen would wear. So let's see, just to give you, here's the act. Our sovereign lord, with advice, consent, and assent of the whole estates, acknowledging His Majesty's sovereign authority, princely power, royal prerogative, and privilege of his crown over all estates, persons, and causes whatsoever within this kingdom, ratifies and approves the Act of Parliament made in the year 1606, anent the king's royal prerogative, and perpetually confirms the same for His Highness, his heirs and successors, as amply, absolutely, and freely in all respects as ever any of His Majesty's royal progenitors did possess and exercise the same, withal remembering that in the Act of Parliament made in the year 1609, anent the apparel of judges, magistrates, and kirkmen, it was agreed that what order soever His Majesty's father of blessed memory could prescribe for the apparel of kirkmen, and sent in writing to his clerk of register, should be a sufficient warrant for inserting the same in the books of Parliament to have the strength of an act thereof, have all consented that the same power shall remain with the person of our sovereign lord and his successors that now it is. It doesn't really address anything new, but I think Charles was trying to make a point, as James often did, on maybe smaller matters. When the Earl of Rose stood up and insisted that the church be consulted and that actually what he wanted was the act to be divided in two. He was willing to confirm that the king had royal prerogative, but he wasn't willing to state that he had it in the specific case of the apparel of the churchmen. King told him to sit down and shut up, or maybe not in those words, but he said, I have all your names here, and I will now know who are good subjects and who are bad. Again, shades of James. There's different accounts. By one account, the act was rejected, but the clerk recorded it as having passed. By another account, it passed, but Rose challenged whether or not it passed, and when he challenged it, and I'm not sure if it passed, why he would challenge whether or not it passed, but when he challenged it, the king basically threatened him with, if his challenge didn't succeed, that it would be considered treasonous. So he decided not to challenge it there. Let's see, the king then shortly thereafter went ahead and issued an order as to what the clergy were to wear. And his official thing goes on. Let's see, we'll probably skip most of it because it relates to things like wearing gowns with standing capes and cassocks, and who could wear tippets when bishops should wear, they should be in whites, wearing white robes, whereas the Scottish, having a fairly simple worship service, had worn black robes. Yeah, I think we'll probably, given the time, we'll skip over that. But the probably wouldn't be that clear anyways. And, you could argue that what they wore, well, okay, that's not all that important, right? But it did demonstrate, and that perhaps this was Charles's point, that he considered himself to be absolute head of the church, right? In that respect, he'd clearly usurped Christ's role as head of the church. Okay, since no debate had been allowed at the trial, no debate had been allowed at the Parliament. Well, it'll come to a trial in a minute here. Some of the people who voted no thought it might be a good idea to send the king a petition, and ask him to reconsider. They drafted a petition, and the petition didn't just cover the act. It also covered some of the taxes. Let's see, Maurice Lee, a historian we've heard from before. He was a biographer of the Earl of Moray. This is his book, The Road to Revolution, Scotland under Charles I, 1625 to 1637. To give you an idea what the petition said, he said that a draft, in respectful but pointed language, that the government had broken faith by renewing the tax on annual rents and was placing an intolerable burden on the king's good subjects with so huge taxations. Those taxations, by the way, are a lot smaller than our taxations. They're less than 10%. That another promise was broken when Parliament failed to consider the grievances expressed in the Convention of Estates in 1625 and 1630. That the Committee of the Articles, or the Lords of the Articles, was rigged because the bishops elected lords who were known either to be popishly affected or of small knowledge of the estate or laws of the country. So that's pretty pointed. That the king's religious policy was disquieting and the religious legislation adopted at the Parliament unnecessary, and that Charles' behavior in refusing to allow debate and in noting the names of the dissenters was unprecedented. Wasn't completely unprecedented, but for good measure the document pointed out that the 5 Articles of Perth had occasioned innumerable evils and distractions, and that reports of an allowance given in England for printing of books full of popery and Arminianism in this country without censure occasioned great apprehension. The conflation of the legislation respecting apparel and prerogative led people to suspect a snare. Blessed King James would never have done such a thing. Well, maybe. This was in the petition, yeah. Well, the petition, the Earl of Rose took it with him to see the king, but he asked him if the king would hear a petition, and the king said that he would if it was the right, that it was the right sort of petition, and but that if he didn't like the petition, then it would be brought at his own peril. So Rose said something like, well, I have a petition here that I haven't given you because you probably wouldn't like it. Would you want to know the contents of it? And he said no, he was too busy. So Rose kind of wisely figured he better not present this to the king. He went back and reported back that this was too hot to handle. And one Lord Balmerino, let's see, kept a copy of it. Okay, for whatever reason, maybe thinking that later on they could rework it and present it. But kept a copy of it. And sometime before June of 1634, he showed a copy of it to a business associate, who made his own copy of it and transmitted it to Archbishop Spotswood, who in turn transmitted it to the king. Well, this was a mistake. Balmerino was seized, and he was charged with being art and part of the penning and setting down of a scandalous libel. Okay, so that's why I read the summary. You can judge for yourself how scandalous this libel was. Lee says, the king's intention was clear enough to strike a blow at the opponents of his religious policy by the prosecution of one of their leaders, and thus cow them into acquiescence. Okay, the trial was held in March of 1565. Even with a stacked jury, he was convicted by one vote only, by a margin of one vote, like 8-7, in effect of having done nothing, of knowing about the document and not having revealed its author. He was acquitted of everything else, but still, by one vote again, he was sentenced to death for this. Charles, like his father, liked to think of himself as an absolute and free monarch. He finally had to face reality here. The charge, the trial, the verdict, and the sentence were hugely unpopular, except with some of the bishops. There were rumors of violence if the sentence were carried out, in other words, that he'd be rescued by force of arms. So Charles finally relented. He reduced the sentence to confinement within a 6-mile radius of his home, and about a year later he gave Balmerino a full pardon. And so, again, this was the sort of bad advice that Charles listened to, what did he gain from this? Well, he alienated a lot of people, but of course he didn't put the guy to death, nothing, and he pardoned him. So in the middle of this affair, he appointed Archbishop Spotswood as Lord Chancellor of Scotland. This was nominally the head of government in Scotland. This was December of 1634. We've skipped over many of the ways that Charles alienated the masses and the nobility in Scotland. Like I've skipped over this whole issue of revocation of the tithes and how this played itself out. And of course, at the same time, he was doing much the same thing in England, right? He didn't lose his head for no reason. It was a series of things where he alienated both the masses and the nobility. But nevertheless, this Balmerino prosecution it's pointed to by secular historians as being one of the key turning points whereby Charles really alienated much of the nobility in Scotland. And I think most of you know where this is headed. Eventually it's headed with Charles losing his head, but just thinking, a sovereign God ordains both the ends and the means, right? So you could argue that this was as secular historians might, that this was one of the steps that led to the alienation of much of the nobility, but then you have to ask the question, well, why did Charles do it? And I think we asked, like last week when we discussed, well, James's reign could have been a lot easier if he'd gone along with the church. Pharaoh's reign could have been a lot easier if he'd let the people go, but God hardened his heart. Okay, that's as far as we're going to go for today. It's 10:29. Questions? Dan.
Were the Puritans again in England? The Puritans again at the sort of the focal point of the persecution? Or was it more general, applied sort of indiscriminately to anyone who sort of said the wrong thing?
Well, okay, I didn't really study it in preparation for the class. From what I know, historically, the Puritans were certainly the focal point for the persecution. But Charles just really alienated Parliament. And it wasn't, and certainly there were Puritans in there that were alienated, but it was certainly, he just widely alienated the sort of English view of their rights of their Parliament, to do various things. And, he basically came in and told them that he was, in effect, an absolute and free monarch, and they had to do whatever he told them. And, right, so he goes in and, Charles spends his career sort of, calls the Parliament to raise taxes, then he gets mad at him and he cancels it. Calls another one, eventually has to call another one, and then he gets mad and cancels it. I think the last Parliament was called, the Rump Parliament. It was a very short Parliament, the tail end of his career. So I don't know in terms of persecution, about the rest of it, but I do know that he really just alienated Parliament. He really went against the grain of the sort of the English view of what their Parliament was for. And
how long did it take? From the time he ascended to the throne to the time
he succeeded to the throne in 1625. I think he was executed roughly 1644. I may not have the year right. In fact, Archbishop Laud, he was executed in 1645. 1649, okay. Well, he was in prison for a while, and he escaped once, and then he was in prison again. And so this English Civil War, do you have the dates of the English Civil War? 1645, okay. And it was, certainly when they cut his head off, I guess it was over at 1650. So. Yeah. No, he didn't last not long. 1642, okay. Mike and Vicki. Mike, go ahead.
My question is more of a theoretical one. Do you think that it is easier for rulers to be tyrannical under an Armenian system than it is to be in a Calvinistic system?
Yes.
And I would much rather have an Armenian heresy throughout the land because it's easier for them to rule.
Yeah, I think so. If you there's a whole book on this, actually. Basically, how Arminianism leads to statism. So, the name of the book actually escapes me, but it was a large part of it was by Otto Scott. And it wasn't just about it. In fact, it was mostly about the continent. It was published by Chalcedon. It was quite a bit of it was about the continent of Europe, rather than, it wasn't just about England and Scotland. Okay, so that was my point. Some of it was about England and Scotland, but a lot of it was, it wasn't just examples drawn from here, it was from elsewhere. I want to say the name of the book was The Glorious Revolution, but I'm not sure that that's, The Glorious Revolution is what happened in 1688. But the book's title is something like that. But it's about how the Reformation changed society and how the Arminian sort of twist on the Reformation actually led back to statism. So, yeah, I think they go together. I'm not. couldn't do a very good job of summarizing all the theses of the book at present, but I'd recommend you obtaining a copy and reading it.
Is it one that you haven't burned yet?
I haven't burned it yet, yeah. So, Vicki. Yeah, we're leading 1637 and 1638 are when this is all leading up to a head. Basically, what's going to happen is Laud will continue on. They're going to try. I mentioned that the king sent this letter saying they should conform their worship of the Church of Scotland to that of England. Well, because the bishops say, no, we can't do that yet, they go back and Laud works, and some of the Scottish bishops work on a slightly adjusted version. And when they try to introduce that, then there's riots, and then that leads to the signing of a national covenant and so forth. And this is not by any means the entire cause of the English Revolution, but it plays into the events happening in England that lead to civil war, so it's closely coupled to it. Okay. Thanks. Simon, would you close in prayer?